new book up.
All right, got it.
Okay. Peter, about his new book, Uprooted, that just came out a couple weeks ago. So we're thrilled to be on Peter's schedule and hear more about the book and his work. So Peter credits who he is today to his disruptive childhood, his state college education from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, his decorated on-the-ground service as a U.S. Army Special Operations team leader in Vietnam, and also his luck of the draw DNA. Out of his accomplished business career grew his first book called All Hands on Deck. And his newest book, which is the reason that he's here tonight, is Uprooted: Family Trauma, Unknown Origins, and the Secretive History of Artificial Insemination. As I mentioned, that came out this month. Peter's the father of 2 and the grandfather of 3. He lives on Cape Cod, although he let me know he's joining us today from California. And you can learn more about Peter on his website, which is peterjboni.com. And I will be putting that in the chat during the presentation this evening. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Betsy. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, those 3 factors of my evolution really frame my reference. And I always thought that was the reason I was the person I was and took my DNA for granted. So in 1995, I was a business leader, a CEO of a high-tech company and I was specializing in companies facing difficulty. And my 75-year-old stroke recovering mother spilled the beans. Dad was not biological. It turned out that after 5 years of marriage, they discovered that he was sterile. And I was conceived via an anonymous sperm donor during the waning days of World War II. Well, maybe many of you discovered something, and I started poking myself because I was still the same person. But at that moment, just everything changed for me. My dad suffered from depression. He was hospitalized several times when I was a child. He ended up taking his own life when I was 16. And old school Italian family really treated that as a flaw, like keep it quiet, hush it up, don't talk about it, don't let that spill over on them. So I grew up feeling, well, abandoned and somewhat flawed myself and overcompensated with a crusty veneer to make certain that I was strong and never vulnerable to be what my dad couldn't be. And that impacted, of course, my marriage as well. So taking my DNA for granted, I was always felt a little different. I was fair complexion in an Italian family. I had my dad's northern Italian blue eyes, but didn't look like anyone in the family. The life achievements I had and the academic achievements, my family found somewhat intimidating as I began to achieve some things, and that was a little confusing for me. But after learning that I was donor conceived, in the old days they called that semi-adopted, by the way, I had really confusing and conflicting emotions. How can you feel deceived and relieved at the same time? How can you feel empty and fulfilled, or grief and exhilaration, or happy and sad, or shame and pride? I just felt it all at the same time. And I learned a word that I never heard before, and maybe all of you learned that word too, misattributed. I learned that I was misattributed in a non-parental event. I never heard those terms before. And the experts think that 2 to 4% of us are misattributed. Some can make a case that it's a little less. Some will make a case that it's a great deal more, but 2 to 4% is a number that the majority will put their arms around and say, okay, we can talk about that. I was not misattributed because it was a closed adoption, a late discovery closed adoption. I wasn't misattributed through an extramarital affair or a one-night stand or a sexual assault, maybe an unreported sexual assault. I wasn't switched at birth. Aunt Martha didn't raise me, and I was not thinking that Aunt Martha was mom and Cousin Mary was really mom. That happens today in families. You're raised by another family member. I was misattributed through a process that my parents willfully participated in. So my birth certificate, I considered a hoax. It was a willful lie kept from me. My wife and my close friends suggested that I perhaps go to see a therapist to help with some of this traumatic turmoil that I was feeling. And I had to get past the old school rendition of therapy, that it was something I saw in the boardroom as well as in the war room. If you need therapy, perhaps you are weak and needy and you're not fit for command. Well, I was a CEO and I needed it, so I kept it very quiet. But I went and I interviewed a few different therapists before I found the right one for me that was specializing in trauma. And he gave me his view. He said, "Congratulations, you just hit a trifecta." The trifecta being that new trauma, this identity trauma that I was experiencing, is a catalyst for old trauma that you thought was long past. For me, a disruptive childhood and the sickness of my dad, and some PTSD from war that I never really dealt with. A soldier returning from Vietnam didn't want anyone to know that he was in Vietnam because society at that time was not really welcoming. So I had a lot of issues and a lot of anger built up over those years, and they all came out as well and resurfaced after this traumatic experience. So in my therapy, I talked to my therapist about genealogical bewilderment. We discussed these two psychologists in the mid-60s that were studying adoptees. And sometimes adoptees had difficulty adjusting or feeling like they belonged because of the raging genealogical bewilderment inside of them. Where did they come from? What was their gene pool and their medical history, and did they have any siblings? Those were the three things that drove me. My mother gave me some clues. She gave me the name of the doctor. Well, she misremembered the name of the doctor. She gave me the address of the fertility clinic. Well, she misremembered that exact address. The doctor was affiliated with Harvard Medical School in some way. I went to Harvard Medical School. I couldn't find any doctor by that name affiliated with Harvard Medical School. And there were no records kept during that time anyway, very much like closed adoption. You couldn't find any records of the sperm donor, and the clinics just did not keep that information. Google in 1995 was 3 years away from being founded. And 21st century technology through 23andMe was 12 years away from coming out as well. So I was bumping against some stone walls that I just couldn't penetrate. So the only thing that I could do, which I found actually therapeutic, was to do a really deep dive into researching the scientific, the sociological, and then the legal history and the evolution of assisted reproductive technology to begin with, and their secretive practices. And I looked at it from early biblical references through to today, looking at the industry that actually created my conception to begin with. And the more I learned about the evolution of assisted reproductive technology, the more I was energized actually to write a tell-all expose from a very unique lens, the lens of somebody who was an NPE. I was donor conceived, and an expose on what has become now a multi-billion-dollar industry with several subsegments that are growing so rapidly that I thought they would attract the likes of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. So I wrote the book in three different sections. The section one, I call the discovery, and I go over the whole of how I felt once I learned that I was donor conceived. I go over the education, the second segment, which is what I learned about the industry, if you will. And then the third section is the revelation, and that is through Ancestry.com and 23andMe, what I learned about myself. Actually, it was in early 2008 that I took the 23andMe test. 23andMe was the innovation of the year, according to Time Magazine, in 2007. So I was one of the early customers. And how much do you think that cost in 2007? $999. There you go. So I spent $999 as an early customer. And I didn't get the answer as to the who. I couldn't find any paternal relative, but I found the what. Okay, I'm not Northern Italian. I'm English, French, and a sliver of Scandinavian. Well, I can live with that. But as the database grew, I waited 9 years for that database to grow, and there was no paternal relative that showed up. My son and my daughter suggested to me that I look at Ancestry.com, and it was in Thanksgiving of 2016, where the family was around the living room. We were cruising through the television looking for a football game or a score, and Black Friday sales were being advertised like crazy on Ancestry.com for then $49, list price $99. So I signed up for the Ancestry.com test. I learned that Ancestry had come into that business in 2012 to supplement their family tree tools from all the records that were on their database. And in 5 years, I actually had a database that had surpassed 23andMe. So I went as an early customer or a later customer of Ancestry.com, and for a $99 list price, as opposed to $999 9 years later, I got some answers 2 months later. And they pointed out close relative, cousin with a question mark. And I contacted that close relative cousin because I knew that relative was not, that I thought was not maternal. It had to be paternal. So I contacted him and asked for some help, gave him my story. And I was a little concerned because I might have been considered a bastard stepchild, finding a seat on King's Court. And I was afraid they might push me away, but I got embraced, and the person told me that they would champion finding the source of my seed in the family tree. So we dug around for several weeks, and I got a call one day saying, "Are you sitting down?" And I got all of my answers. In the course of that, I learned that the industry, the donor conception industry, actually had practices, secret practices, that would conceive dozens, if not 100 or more siblings from the same donor without anyone's knowledge. And I went to a friend of mine and started telling him what I was learning, and he gave me his rendition. He said, "You know, Peter, I used to breed Rottweilers, and I'll tell you that there's more regulation, there's more oversight to breeding puppies than there is breeding, or rather conceiving human beings." So when I heard that, I thought, gosh, this could be a thought-provoking book, and I really need to start writing this down. In the scandalous history of artificial insemination, in section 2, and again in the appendix of my book, I go over the 10 top secrets. The 10 top secrets of assisted reproductive technology. And the first one is actually that artificial insemination started on the farm in the 13th century, and it was perfected in the 19th century by what was an exiled mad scientist who history labels Red Frankenstein. And I go over that in detail. That's a fun story. Artificial insemination by husband was actually alleged in 1462 by a medieval king who was making certain that he had a successor to the throne, but the child was not likely his. It was through an extramarital affair of his wife. He went through a good deal of shenanigans with delivering the sperm absentia to his wife, and his half-sister disproved that and took the throne. That was Queen Isabella of Spain. So the book will recount that. The third secret of assisted reproductive technology is that artificial insemination, actually by a husband, was first documented in the 18th century by a physician of English royalty. And we'll go over that in the book as well. But the first artificial insemination by donor, this surprised me, was in the year 1884, actually in a medical school at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. And it was under somewhat shady circumstances that today would be considered a criminal act inside of a med school. So we'll go over that as well. The artificial insemination by donor at the med school was actually made public in 1909 by the very handsome doctor who had provided the sperm to inseminate this woman. And with that, 20th century artificial insemination by donor began to be launched. And church and state just drove this practice underground. The Roman Catholic Church and the Archbishop of Canterbury all condemned it. Other religions piled on. They considered it adulterous. The Archbishop of Canterbury suggested that a donor be criminally liable for his act to aid and abet an adulterous event. And the press began to pile on with allegations of adultery by doctor. At the time of my conception in early 1945, there was a Time magazine article, and it was in the legal section. And it went over a legal case that was in the courts in Cook County, Illinois, the Superior Courts, where a husband was granted a divorce from his wife on the grounds of adultery since she had a child through artificial insemination by donor. And that child was considered to be illegitimate. Now, the title of that article was Artificial Bastards with a question mark. So this kind of sociology drove the practice underground, and there were handbooks written by doctors and lawyers to enable the fertility community to conceive donor children by bypassing this. For instance, for me, it was a typical case. My mother's obstetrician did not know anything about the fertility specialist. So he could sign the birth certificate that that her husband, my dad, was in fact the father of that child. So I was a legal entity, and there was no embarrassment from my dad that he was sterile. A 1945 Italian man being sterile, it was an embarrassment. There was no likely blackmailing of my parents. There was no allegation of adultery for my mom, and no allegation of assisting adultery for that doctor. So that was typical of the practice. So here I am today, looking at an industry that got its goose in the middle of the 20th century, thanks to frozen bull sperm back to the farm, that enabled frozen human sperm, that enabled the construction of the sperm bank industry. Now, the sperm bank industry gave way to the egg bank industry and the embryo industry, but the science significantly advanced well ahead of the sociology. The practice in the sperm banks, frozen sperm actually started out being insurance sperm after World War II. Vasectomy became a more popular way of male birth control. So if anyone wanted to have an insurance sperm before getting a vasectomy, they would freeze their sperm. Or if they were undergoing cancer treatment, chemotherapy, that would certainly render them sterile, the insurance sperm would be the way to deal with that. But the insurance sperm marketplace was too small a market to really allow the banks to gain a foothold. So they began to target the fertility practitioner, and there were only 500 fertility practitioners globally in the mid-60s. But the advent of the AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s began to really stimulate the activity of using frozen sperm within these sperm banks. And the fertility practitioners grew from 500 in the mid-60s to about 11,000 by the mid-90s. And the sperm banks grew from 10 in the 60s to about 135 by the mid-90s. But they were loosely organized, and many of them were mom and pop operations, actually doc and pop operations. Sometimes they were just in a single doctor's office. And as the world turned in the 2001 recession, the 9/11 recession occurred, they just couldn't compete anymore and store all the sperm and afford to do the donor recruiting. And the industry, like many industries, consolidated. Today, there are 28 sperm banks in 16 locations around the country, located principally in the East, the West, and the upper Midwest. So the industry then is operated like Harrods or Macy's or Nordstrom's. They have not medical practitioners, but Procter & Gamble merchandisers that are doing internet marketing and cataloging and FedEx shipments, warranties. And what I learned in business is that from an inventory standpoint, there's the 80-20 rule. Ever heard of the 80-20 rule? 80% of the inventory is preferred, or the other way around, 80% of the people prefer 20% of the inventory. There are favorites, milk, eggs, bread, poultry, cheese, and what have you. And the other 20% of the inventory purchased by 80% of the, or 80% of the inventory purchased by 20% of the people. You take this practice and the fact that the top 5 sperm banks by 2001 had 100 donors each, and they provided half of the demand. They fulfilled half of the demand. And you do the 10-year life of a sperm that's frozen on top of that, and it's no wonder you have 100+ siblings per donor coming out. Now, there's no regulation on this. There's no regulation that says that you can't have only a certain amount of children conceived from a gamete. There's no regulation that says that the genetic testing has to be done, or the disclosure of health history has to be done on this gamete either. The industry gives a form to fill out for the person doing the donation, and they take that for granted. It's not checked. There are too many cases reported of the PhD that speaks 4 languages that is not a PhD speaking 4 languages. He's a convicted felon and a schizophrenic. And his several dozen conceived children as they grow have issues. That would all be eliminated with any kind of regulation. There's no limit to the offspring per donor. There's an association called the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the ASRM. Now, this is not a governance organization. This is a trade association. And it's not American. It's only American in name only, because their membership is in over 100 different countries. So a trade association provides education and networking for its members, and they provide public policy. Well, that's another way to say they're a lobbyist. And a multi-billion-dollar industry has a lot of what my 8th grade science teacher taught me, has a lot of inertia, and inertia is a powerful force. Why change this multi-billion-dollar industry if we're all doing so well? There's no requirement for a sibling registry to get these dozens, if not 100 or more siblings to know one another. How would you like to date a sibling? How would you like your children to date children of your siblings. There's no donor or recipient counseling that's mandated about the needs of the donor-conceived child. And there's no legal recourse, there's no laws in the books for blatant fertility fraud. Now, these things are just flat out wrong in my estimation. I aspire for my book to be an advocacy vehicle, a go-to book for the assisted reproductive technology industry, past, present, future, donors, recipients, medical practitioners, psychologists, therapists, legal practitioners, how about legislators? I'd like to impact the reproductive technology positively. I'm all for science, and I'm thrilled that science will enable people that want to have a family have a family. And donors have rights and recipients have rights, but I don't see any laws in the books about the rights of the donor-conceived people like me. And I'd like to have the book speak for the feelings of many misattributed people and the well-being of many misattributed people, whether you are semi-adopted like me, really adopted, the product of an extramarital affair, or what have you. So my open question now, I started this thing looking for my genealogy, raging with bewilderment. I wanted to know my medical history. I have that answer. And I wanted to know if I had any siblings. Well, my only open question now is how many siblings do I have really? I'm not the product of the frozen sperm generation. My parents had an ethical doctor who did not use his own sperm on countless numbers of his patients. So I'm not likely to have 100. But every February, we call it new sibling season. Black Friday sales at $49, 8 weeks to process the little stocking stuffer. And 2 million people are added to the database every February. I went for 3 years with no new activity, no new close relatives that I could see. And then just last February, I had a real flurry. So we'll see what happens this new sibling season. This is already the end of January, so we'll see what happens a new sibling season. The real bonus for me, I was raised as an only child. The real bonus for me is I have a couple of sisters that look like me. We like one another, and we have a good time together. And they've been very open with me, and I with them. This has been, I'll call it a home run. But many people have a different experience. They are not welcomed by folks that they find they have a strong DNA connection with. So on that note, hopefully new sibling season will come up, and we'll find, all of us might find some new people in our database of activity. I didn't get into this to start a new family. I got into this to answer my questions, and I'll be happy to take yours as well.
Thank you, Peter. Fascinating, and so many parallels with the secrets and lies in the adoption world as well. So we did have 4 questions that were submitted with registration. If some of our audience has other questions, please put them in the chat. Starting with the 4 that we had with the advanced registration, some of these are kind of specific. What are the challenges to parents and child from adopting a frozen embryo left over from IVF done by other people?
That's really a good question, and there's some opinion on this as well. And I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on frozen embryoi. I attended a session not long ago where a PhD was going over his findings of health issues with frozen sperm, frozen egg, and frozen embryo, depending upon how long they were frozen. So I'd look at that as a challenge. You don't want to purposefully bring a child into the world that is going to have some genetic health issues because of that. I'd like to see the health history and heredity of the sperm and the egg donors that produce that embryo to make certain that there's not an issue there with a child as well. And you don't want to raise your child with genealogical bewilderment. So some activity of understanding the background of the people that enabled that embryo to begin with, I think are all challenges.
Thank you. The next question that was submitted is, what is a good way to introduce the fact to a child that's been donor conceived to the child and also to other family members?
Well, we've all been a product of secrets and lies. And that didn't feel all that good when I was 49 years old to learn what I had learned at any age, actually. The researchers, the psychologists that are all looking at this now will tell you that the very best thing for the development of the child is to let him know early on in simple terms. And then as he gets older and the questions grow, you can answer them to a greater degree. But don't keep secrets. No secrets in the family. I start my book with a quote from Buddha. Three things are most certainly appear: the sun, the moon, and the truth. No secrets. Don't raise your child with secrets.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's, again, parallels to adoption. People ask this in adoptive families as well. And I think kids are really resilient and grow up with whatever's normal in their family, whatever they've been told. And sometimes when we have a program, parents ask, say, well, I have a 10-year-old and I haven't told him yet, how do I do this? Or when do I do this? And my heart always thinks it's like, well, like 10 years ago.
Yeah, just make it part of the child's woodwork.
Yeah.
And it's ingrained, and it's not a big deal. And the family knows it too. And it's not a secret. It's nothing to be shameful.
Right. Well, thanks. How do you navigate the many brick walls when you're so close to finding out your origins and continue hitting brick walls? I know you were in that space for a long time, Peter, while you were searching over 22 years, right?
Well, 21st century technology helped advance my revelation, certainly. One brick wall is that you're stonewalled by others that have your DNA, but they're threatened by this. I made a mistake last year when I first approached a close relative that was found on Ancestry.com, because I was a real bull and went out there and said, hey, I'm donor conceived and you're a relative. And I was advised by We Are Donor Conceived that perhaps I would take a softer approach. And I used that softer approach the next time up, where I simply outreached and said, if you'd like to explore how we are connected, I'd be happy to surface that with you. And I found a partner in that, and actually found a half sister as a result of that. But my first approach with what was essentially a half niece, I was pushed out, and I'm still pushed out today. If you're having trouble figuring it out you have a third cousin and you can't figure out where he came from, there's DNA detectives and angels in the community that can help you, that have a little bit more expertise, certainly, than I do, to be able to follow the DNA to find the source of your seed, if that's what you're looking for, or find a relative if that's what you're looking for. So there's lots of help out there. But to answer, the biggest mistake I made was the stone wall that I created, because I was just too much of a bull. Personality flaw.
it always helps to get advice from people who have walked that path before, right? And so I just posted a link. We also have search support for adoptees. I'm doing traditional search techniques and also DNA. So I put that in the chat as well. So another participant wanted to know that they wanted to have your advice. They have a family member that was donor conceived, but the parents refused to tell her. The child is 16 now. So that's a difficult situation to be in. Any advice on that?
Yeah, well, everyone's different in how they approach these things. My view is back to Buddha. You know, three things are certainly going to appear: the sun, the moon, and the truth. How do you deal? I would ask myself, how would I deal with my relationship with a 16-year-old when she's 25 and she learns the truth and then learns that I knew all along and never told her? See, I would struggle with that more so than anything. I would personally, my own style, I would sit down with the parents to say, Buddha's alive and well, and that's going to come out. It'll come out from you. It'll come out by accident. But if you don't do it, I'm going to. So let's figure it out together. But everyone's different. Every family circumstance is different. That's just me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then we had a couple of questions in chat about your specific situation. And I'm going to put them together because maybe they'll weave into each other. One person asked specifically, did you find your donor father? And someone else posted, were your sisters raised together or also donor conceived?
My donor father, I did identify. I identified him thanks to his unnatural daughter, who is 7 years younger than I. He passed away a couple of months before I discovered that I was donor conceived from my 75-year-old stroke recovering mother. So I really thought that what my mother told me is that her doctor, the fertility specialist, said to trust him, that he knew my dad and he would find a suitable donor and he would likely be affiliated with Harvard Medical School in some way. So I used to go to Harvard Medical School and look at the roster of graduates from 1945, 46, 47, 48. I figured he was a med student. And I carried that around with me for 22 years. I was convinced that I would find the source of my seed on that list. I found he was affiliated with Harvard Medical School in a loose way, and I found B.F. Skinner was in that mix as well. And the book goes over the detail of that discovery. I also discovered a donor sibling who is 5 months younger than me. In the book, she's identified as Bernadette, and I hadn't had any contact with her by the time the book was in its final editing and at the printing press. But I have discovered an Irish twin.
So just to count up, I think that you were telling me before we got started that you have 6 known siblings so far.
I think I'm one of 6. There's some in Connecticut. The stone wall is there. There's a half niece who I think her father was donor conceived, but she's doing the stone wall. And my half sister from the donor unnatural has a brother that is doing a stone wall as well.
Thanks. A couple other questions were posted. Are there any new regulations or practices of verifying the information that donors submit currently?
You know, there's a patchwork quilt, Betsy, of activity legally on a state by state by state by state basis. And it will address one piece of the donor conceived Bill of Rights as I outlined it, or another piece. But there's nothing that's packaging it together. And it's all very loosely drawn out state by state, and there's no federal activity on this. So my hope and dream is that I can use this book to somewhat shine a light on the legislative agenda on a federal basis on this.
And the next question actually feeds into that. What would it take to get the sperm banks to preserve identifying information of the donor and to provide that to the child at age 18 or upon request?
Well, some banks claim that they will do that today. They'll have an open donor, and that information will be given to the child at age 18. The hook is that it's kind of up to the parent, and the donor can change his mind. So there's nothing mandated on that. It's just too loose. So what would it take? How about a law? Not guidance, but how about a law?
Can you talk about what you know about what the opposition, like why isn't there a law? Tell us more about that.
Well, once again, we have an industry that's multi-billion dollars in several segments, growing at double digits. And I'm back to my science teacher. You know, inertia is a powerful force. Why do you want to change something that's working so well and so many people are making a lucrative amount of money on it? You know, the markup on a gamete, sperm, egg, embryo, the markup is something like 4,000%. Now, I've been in business, and that's pretty strong gross margin. The business model is exceptional.
Yeah, money speaks.
Yeah.
So, you know, thinking out loud, I wonder, you know, your father and probably other donors, you know, might maybe have donated many times and they don't necessarily know how many children were produced or if any children were even produced.
Well, it's all, the anonymity breeds hush hush, and they have no idea. I'm sure that my donor had no idea, and we don't have any idea. But once again, he wasn't a product of the frozen sperm generation. Everything was a live fire exercise, and I just don't know how many times.
Yeah. So one participant said, since there's no age limit on donor sperm, is there an issue of being conceived by someone possibly from a former generation? You know, I hadn't really thought about that, but that seems like possible.
Most of the early sperm donors, the target was men in their 30s that were married or about to be married, less need for checking disease. And that was really the target, someone who was already established and you could say, okay, this is a sound donor. Actually, to be a donor then or to be a recipient then was probably just as difficult as getting into Harvard Medical School. Today, it's a little different. The donors used to be primarily medical students. That opened up to be students in general. And now every Tom, Dick, and Harry can walk in from the street, fill out a form, and make some money.
Mm-hmm. And it could be frozen and saved for who knows how long. One of our participants just posted about hearing recently about a donated embryo being used by a woman 20 years after it was stored.
And the statistics I recently heard from this PhD was and study the health aspect of those old embryos was really questionable. Issues, physical and mental.
Actually, reading that comment more closely, it was used by a woman younger than the embryo.
Mm-hmm.
Embryo had been around for more than 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of twists and turns on that road.
Yeah, well, speaking of twists and turns, I talked about the first secret of artificial insemination, and that was the Red Frankenstein. The 10th secret hasn't been unveiled yet, and that is that the next Red Frankenstein hasn't been nicknamed yet. Monash University in Australia is a key leading reproductive technology university that last February announced that they had a model embryo from human skin. No egg, no sperm. Now, we've been cloning sheep on a farm and Cocker Spaniels, but without some ethics on this particular situation, Red Frankenstein is yet to be named. And science will not stand still. Science will be exploring the unknown.
Well, I understand from reading that beyond even purchasing sperm through a sperm bank, there's also kind of a, I don't know if it's called a black market, but direct to consumer market for sperm as well.
This is the travesty. This is off the rails now. We're into a pandemic. It's been a couple of years. The amount of people going out and donating is actually down a little. And people are staying at home and maybe have a little bit more time to think about raising a family. So the market for sperm is up 20%. So there are private Facebook groups even, and organizations like Match.com or Etsy that are selling their sperm on the open market, but they can't sell the sperm legally because it's a human tissue. It's the same regulation as tissue banks, but they can get a service fee and get reimbursed for travel at the same time. So off the rails. And without some kind of a law, this will continue to be a Wild West. And the Wild West has gone off the rails.
Well, thank you. Any other?
Thanks for bringing that out. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think I caught all the questions that were in the chat. Anything that I missed or anything else that people would like to know? We have a few minutes left. Time for one or two, probably, more questions. I see somebody raising your hand. Feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I didn't do well on the chat. I first became aware of this, and I think the book was called The Inheritance, written by a woman who discovered she was a sperm donor child.
Yeah, I think Danny Shapiro.
Right. And I'm just thinking, like you, Peter, she looked around and knew, like so many kids do, that something doesn't fit. I don't look like, I don't relate like, we just underestimate children all the time.
Yeah, Danny is a known author and a fine author as well. She's written several books, and she did this as a memoir upon discovering that she was donor conceived. My book is a little different because I'm combining the history and evolution, the scientific, the legal, and the sociological history and evolution of this industry from the lens of somebody that is donor conceived.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for all the research you did, because
thank you.
Who would know?
So Peter, we have a librarian in the audience who wants to know how you pitched your book to the publisher.
Well, just that. My differentiation is that I'm not I'm not Bon Jovi. I'm Peter J. Boni. I'm not Bruce Springsteen. I'm not Bono. I'm B-O-N-I. Initially, I got interest from a variety of publishers that told me, well, since you're not Bon Jovi, let's get rid of the memoir piece and just talk about the tell-all expose. And I didn't want to just write a tell-all expose without expressing some of the feelings of misattribution and what that was like, and do the history from that lens. So I pitched it several times, and oftentimes I got the answer that I'm not Bon Jovi. But I'm persistent, and I found an audience, and the book resonated well with that audience. And Greenleaf Book Group is a fine publisher with global distribution.
Okay, we have a couple of other, so one participant brought up about racial issues with donors, and I've read articles where sperm was mixed up, and the sperm that somebody thought they were using was mixed up with someone else, and they, by surprise, ended up having a child of a different race. So any comments about that type of thing?
Yeah, well, back to regulation, number one, and this speaks to somewhat of a commoditization of a child as well. You're custom ordering something. Does it have the right color eyes, and is it good in math, or is it better in the arts? You're really custom designing things. There's a kind of an ethics issue I have with the whole program.
Yep. And one participant said that she's surprised that there was a market for private sperm on Etsy. And I think you were saying that there's sites like Etsy. I don't think it's Etsy itself necessarily where you can buy sperm, although maybe, I don't know.
I haven't checked the Etsy site lately, but it wasn't there, but it's like Etsy, custom designed. Do you get what you want? Is it the right height, the right eye color? Does it have the right skill set of math or art or what have you? But it's like Match.com. You can certainly do that. It's cataloging in that regard.
Right.
But the sociology has changed so much since I was conceived. Today, it's not only a heterosexual couple. You don't have to be married. It could be a same-sex couple, or it could be a single person, man or a woman, that wants to raise a family or have a child, and they'll use the benefits of science to enable them to do that. And that's expanded the marketplace for fertility services exponentially as well. But we're still using secrets, we're still using anonymity.
Right. Okay, one last question before we wrap up. Are you aware of any stakeholder groups that would be supportive of regulation in the industry toward the rights for the donor conceived?
I think there's one on the call.
I think you mentioned a few groups, yeah.
Aaron Jackson, the organization We Are Donor Conceived, they've been a terrific asset for me and a terrific asset for the donor conceived community as well.
Thank you.
Betsy Kelly Comey had a question.
Okay. I don't think I saw it. Let me see.
I popped in and out. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I know a couple that's a same-sex marriage, and they both got pregnant from the same sperm donor. How does that, I have a feeling these two boys are going to have some problems because they have the same dad, but their moms both got pregnant from the sperm donor. Well, I don't know what the question is exactly, but
they're half brothers.
Yes, yeah, I guess so.
Well, let me relate a story. This has nothing to do with half brothers, but when I learned that I was donor conceived, I told myself just no more secrets. And I went to my Italian cousins and I told my Italian cousins that I'm not Italian and I don't know what I am, but I'm not the product of my dad. And they labeled me a logical Italian and they labeled me a logical cousin. So the notion of family was a lot more than just blood. The notion was shared experiences, shared foods, shared stories, shared values. They were really embracing with me. And if anything, that increased our intimacy as cousins because I shared this with them it really impacted our relationship very positively. So I'm back to no more secrets. The kids are growing up together. If they know it right up front, it's a lot easier than being surprised when they're 18 or 28 or 38 or 49 like I was.
Okay, thank you.
thank you for reiterating that point. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening and for participating. Thank you especially to Peter for sharing your deep knowledge on this topic and your wisdom and volunteering your time with us tonight. We really appreciate it. As many of you know, Adoption Network is a nonprofit organization serving individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. I do want to make a note on the advocacy front. We've put our toe in the water, at least on donor-conceived issues, starting in Ohio with some legislation that would outlaw fertility fraud, which is not addressed in Ohio law currently. And that's House Bill 64 right now. To find out more about our organization or to support our work, please visit our website, which is adoptionnetwork.org. We are a membership organization. We hope that you'll consider joining us as a member. And I mentioned several programs at the beginning. Our next actual Monday evening speaker series is on February 14th. So we hope to see you then. There's lots of other programs that we have between now and then that you can find on our calendar. So thank you for joining us. And Peter, if you want to stay on, we'll chat for a second to wrap up after.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody, Betsy. It's Uprooted, Family Trauma, Unknown Origins, and the Secretive History of Artificial Insemination, www.peterjboni.com, B-O-N-I. Thanks very much for your support.
Thank you.